right, for my last question, I would like to go back to the collective that you've just mentioned before, the Zetkin collective, which proposes to theorize the scenario of fossil fascism, which is defined as the alliance between fossil capital and the denialist far right, emerging in response to climate policies and the threat of stranded assets. So would you characterize Trump's administration as denialist in the strict sense? Or does it instead represent a form of carbon cynicism, meaning acknowledging climate realities while doubling down on fossil fuel expansion for political and economic gain?
Yeah, this is a very important question right now that picks up on some of the preamble to kind of this whole topic in this interview about, how to evaluate climate politics in this moment. I'll just put it that way, right? And I myself have actually moved back and forth on this question, so I'll just be transparent about that back and forth movement, which more or less tracks the back and forthness of the reality, right? But still, we want to get analytic leverage and maybe take sometimes some distance to that volatility, but it's hard to escape it right now. So what I'm referring to more concretely is that there was obviously a long era in which it was absolutely clear that not only was the right wing in full climate denial mode, not only, of course, was fossil capital in full climate denial, and the word denial is important because denial is not lack of knowledge. It is knowledge that you repress, cover up, censor, right? And so denial was never about like, oh, we just don't think it has this effect. It's like, we know that emissions have this effect, or we know that fossil fuels produce emissions that have this effect, and we are denying it, right? Which is very important. The Exxon new kind of campaign and uncovering of how deeply aware Exxon was, why its own actually uncannily accurate predictions about global warming and about the effects of fossil fuel-based emissions on the atmosphere. So anyway, there was this denial period. That seemed to give way. We could roughly periodize this, and I draw very much on Malm and Carton's work here, which I've been reading. We can roughly periodize this in the sort of 2018, maybe 2015 to 2021 or two kind of moment, where for a variety of reasons, which I will not catalog, but I want to name briefly, schematically, which are everything from Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg, Sunrise Movement, these really fairly active youth movements around climate, to kind of some important technological developments where we had cheaper solar panels and batteries and it seemed more viable to kind of build a green economy, to also the escalating geopolitics, and partly for that reason, Western states taking more interest in like beating China at the kind of climate tech game, right? And also, during the pandemic, to like a moment where we also saw like really reduced fossil fuel use, right? Because we weren't commuting and traveling as much, and so the emissions went down. So it also seemed like a moment to take advantage of. Like we can sort of see the what a greener economy might look like today, that type of thing. So there were a bunch of different reference points to this conjuncture, but the point is there seemed to be finally a confrontation, even in like the liberal establishment, but definitely on the left and among activists, with the realities of fossil capitalism, of real, like, we can no longer deny, it's so clear what is happening with the climate crisis. It's not something that we are just talking about in low-lying islands, like it's coming into the global north, terrible summers in Europe, right, that killed people, like just heat waves and flooding and all of this type of stuff. So we got to a moment in that 2018 to 2021 or so, the height of it, period, where it seemed like we had moved from like denial to this kind of re-articulation of the climate crisis as an investment opportunity, right? That's where we get this green capitalism takeoff in the way I've defined green capitalism, right? And state and green industrial policy in the global north, also, of course, in the global south, so I don't want to ignore that, right? And it almost feels like we're in a counter-revolutionary moment to that or something, like there was, because it feels like denial is back. It also feels like the right wing was alert to some of the transformative possibilities of massive green public investment. Like it was just too close to the Green New Deal. Even though we never won the Green New Deal, it like suggested the possibility of states intervening to do welfare promoting and like, public investment promoting kind of, interventions. And the right wing like has there are implications of that are completely opposed to their interests, right? And so like, it actually, and it goes back to what I was saying about denial, like denial was never about like a lack of knowledge of climate harm. It was about a knowledge that needed to be repressed because the knowledge of climate harm could inspire public action that stranded the assets of fossil fuel companies. So like it was a real fear that if the knowledge of the climate crisis gets out there, public policies and social movements and the whole kind of political system is going to do things that would be bad for the interests of fossil capital, right? So we see a kind of return of that fear combined with, and I think the carbon cynicism has something to it, combined with a real awareness that like we're screwed. Like, I mean, the planet is in severe crisis, and like the best the ruling class can do for itself is like wall itself, is like get the profits while they're good, get some inheritance to their grandkids, build walls, and make sure that they are able, and I mean walls in all senses, like border walls, sea walls to their fancy apartment buildings and mansions, right? And like protect themselves from the reality that they're aware of, while they simultaneously buttress their profits and their benefits from fossil capital, while they also strongly argue against like this prior turn towards publicly investing to create a green economy, right? And so they're mixing, it's a kind of mix of different strategies, but they all redound to like eking out what you can of fossil capital while like, we can still sort of do that, protecting your interests in the crudest sense. A kind of nihilism almost on the right, like a kind of awareness that maybe there is secular stagnation, to go back to our earlier arguments. Maybe profitability is going to run its course, and maybe also the wildfires and flooding is going to come pretty close to even the mansions, right? So like, what do we do in this moment? But just kind of like really just protect in the crudest sense, like our political and economic interests. And this has real effects, including on the liberal establishment. And so I'll just end there. Like, as I said, we're seeing this real like resurgent power and profitability of fossil capital, right? We're also seeing that in these geopolitical conflagrations, security is taking precedence over sustainability. We're seeing liberals much more comfortable with like buttressing the security state than they are with continuing to promote green investment. And those liberals are too, unfortunately in the US especially, in the pockets of also the fossil fuel industry, which has also, not coincidentally, dropped all of its commitments to like net zero by X date, right? So it is a very concerning conjuncture where I don't think it's quite right to say that history moves backwards, but I do feel like we've lost some ground on these very basic issues. And I think that we on the left are going to have to get pretty trenchant in our analysis of fossil capitalism and how it operates politically and economically. And I'm just, again, following Malm and Carton here. We're going to have to understand almost at a psychological level how the ruling class operates when it's in a moment of almost violent nihilism, right? Which includes this carbon cynicism, right? And we'll just use any tactic to protect the wealth that it can amass in the moment and not sort of worry about what happens a few decades later, whether to the planet or to capitalism itself, right? And that almost short-termism that is quite relevant there as well. And so what does the left do here? Do we do what Malm and Carton, I think, might suggest, which is get more confrontational with fossil capital? How do we do that in a moment of heightened state security and the risk of criminalization, right, for those very pipeline blocking activities, right? Do we have a different strategy to deal with the geopolitical crises of our day that don't build up the power of the military-industrial complex and keep us more on track towards a green transition? And then how does all of this, because I've been a bit global north-centric here, interact with what we're seeing out of the global south, which is like a continued desire to do kind of green developmentalism and green industrial policy and leverage their extractive sectors in some cases towards a kind of developmental program in which they are moving up the supply chain into more value-added goods. And they are doing that in increasing coordination with China, which is then itself deepening some of the conflicts between the West and China, right? So just to sort of bring it full circle, that's why we're very much in another moment of kind of reckoning over extractive sectors and the geopolitics of them, the profitability of them, and the social and environmental impacts of them, and whether or not they afford any route to kind of real economic sovereign development for the global south, or whether that is itself a trap and not possible, right? All these questions are very live in our moment, but I think the risks and the stakes are heightened in a way where quite a bit of care is needed in analysis, which is why I think this is, such a good type of conversation to be had, and quite a bit of care and also comradely debate is needed in terms of what our political strategy might be.